1 year after my father passed away, my sister, my brother, and I decided to find the plane crash site where he crashed and survived with a passenger for 49 days, average 40 degrees below zero weather, February 1963. This was my father's airplane, the Howard DGA-15. The DGA stood for Damn Good Airplane. It was known for having an extremely large engine for the short fuselage. The plane was built extra heavy duty to accommodate the large engine. You might say if Carroll Shelby designed airplanes, this would be the one. Problem was, how do you find a place where no one knows exactly where it is? I searched all the newspapers, clippings, magazines, anything I could find. The only real facts I discovered were, number one, he took off from Whitehorse, Yukon, and number two, he crashed about 5 miles southeast of Aeroplane Lake in British Columbia. So I searched for flight services in Whitehorse and Watson Lake areas. I waited 2 days, no callbacks. So I decided to try a second time. After calling the first 5 flight services again, it was the same reply. If you can't tell us exactly where it is, we can't help you. The 6th call was to Trans-North Helicopters. When I gave the receptionist my name, she said, "My boss wants to speak to you." I next spoke to Bob Cameron, the operations manager. When I began to explain to him who I was, he said, "I know who you are. I remember the day your dad was lost, and I remember the day he was rescued. In fact, I had the stern wheel yoked to your father's Howard, and I had the longitude-latitude coordinates for the crash site." Wow. Talk about luck, coincidence, fate. From that point on, Bob Cameron had become our guardian angel. He made our expedition to search for the crash site possible. We set the date, and then we were off to Whitehorse. At Whitehorse, we stayed at the Taku Hotel, the same hotel my father stayed at before taking off from Whitehorse. Early next morning, I had arranged 2 interviews for the press. First, at the Canadian Broadcasting Studio, and our voices were heard live across Canada. Our next and final stop on the interview trail was the Whitehorse Star newspaper. We were surprised to see a large photograph in the lobby of the newspaper. It was the picture of the SOS my father tramped out in the snow, which later led to their rescue. We finished our interview, and then it was off to Trans-North Helicopters. Behind us was our chariot for the next 3 days. It was a Bell Ranger 206 helicopter, 5 passengers, cruised at 150 miles an hour, and had a range of 300 miles. This is Chris Gishon, Trans-North's chief pilot. Chris had experience flying all over the world, including the Himalayas, and he knew the Yukon like the back of his hand. The expedition team was now complete. We were ready to find our father's crash site. So we took off for our first stop, Watson Lake, which is southeast 200 miles. In 1963, there was no GPS, so you had 2 choices to reach your destination. Either fly on instruments, if no visibility, or follow the Alaskan Highway. This would be the same point of view my father would have had when he traveled in 1963. The view was always endless wilderness, broken up by the lakes and the meadows. Bob told us we would be landing at Watson Lake soon to unload and only take what was absolutely necessary to conserve fuel for the next destination, the crash site. After we took off from Watson Lake, our next landmarker was Aeroplane Lake, approximately 70 miles south, and then we would begin the search 5 miles southeast. Then, sure enough, after passing the lake, we were in a valley, mountain ranges both sides. This is known as the Rocky Mountain Trench, the northern end of the Rocky Mountain chain. The crash site was somewhere on the side of the mountain range to the left. When we reached the 5-mile mark, we followed an imaginary grid. We had 40 minutes worth of fuel to find the crash site. Back and forth, back and forth. We were down to 5 minutes left, and then my sister Lisa shouted out, "Oh my gosh, I think I see it." Chris turned the Bell Ranger around for a closer look and then made another pass. There it is, 35 years later. We were so excited. Then Bob slowed our celebration down by saying, "The hardest part is not finding the crash site. The hard part will be getting to it." His words were prophetic. We searched the immediate area for a clearing large enough to land the Bell Ranger. Nothing. Fuel consumption was becoming a factor. So about 1 mile downslope from the crash site, we spotted a potential site for landing the helicopter and which also would work for a campsite. We landed, and the first thing we discovered was marsh-type ground cover, unsuitable for camping. So Bob, Chris decided we should unload the helicopter to save on fuel, and then they would go alone and search for the campsite. About 30 minutes later, they returned, and they had cleared out a nook on the side of the mountain in the distance. Nook was an understatement. There was just enough room for the skids of the helicopter to be in the solid ground. The entire tail section was hanging off the side of a cliff. About 3 feet to the right of my brother was the cliff's edge. We made a campfire for warmth and to keep the bears and wolves away while we cooked our meal. We then pitched camp, and then something spectacular happened. The aurora borealis. This display of color and sky alone made the trip worthwhile. The following morning, Bob showed us the general direction of the crash site. They figured we were about 1.5 miles away. However, between us and the crash site were 3 small valleys. Our mission was to find the clearing which Bob and Chris had spotted about 1/4 mile from the crash site. Frank, Bob, and myself would make the trek to the clearing. We loaded up with a rifle, an axe, a sweet saw, and a machete, and 6 peanut butter and jam sandwiches. We first had to climb down a cliff just like this one. It was about an 80-foot vertical drop. You can tell by the angle of the descent that this was no easy task, slippery and steep. And when you got to the bottom out of breath, you looked up and you realized you had to do this all over again. Only climbing up was even harder. We had to traverse across 3 of these large ravines. The trees were so thick that you could maybe see 10 feet in any direction. And Bob told us that this is the same type of terrain our father would have encountered when he trekked to find another campsite. It was here I realized how much more I appreciated the strength of my father's will to survive. It was summer for us. Can't imagine how much more difficult it would be in midwinter. How did my father ever find the strength to reach the valley below and then return to the crash site? 4 feet of snow, 40 below. Not any real shelter and no food for the past 40 days. When we reached the slope side of the mountain, Bob felt that we were close to the clearing. Bob fired a shot from the rifle to signal Chris to come and guide us to the clearing. When Chris came within range of the walkie-talkie, Bob guided him to be above us, and Chris pointed the helicopter in the direction of the clearing and then flew back to camp. We next reached a plateau. Bob said we were close, and sure enough we were. We spent the next 3 hours clearing and cutting trees and brush. Bob fired off 2 shots, signaling the clearing was ready. Both Frank's and mine hands were full of blisters, not to mention absolutely drained of energy. Chris soon arrived and touched down without any problems. We loaded up what we needed for the short trek to the crash site. Bob asked us to spread 3 across and pointed us in the direction of the crash site. We began the final steps. All the work getting here was now unimportant. All that mattered now is that we were very, very close. Then we all shouted out at the same time, "I see it!" And there it was. My first reaction upon reaching the crash site was how could anyone ever think they could be rescued, seen, or found, knowing how remote this location is. Upon impact, the engine hit the ground first. The engine mounts broke, forcing the engine into the firewall and then rolled forward. This caused the passenger, Helen Claiborne, to have a broken arm and an injured foot. The injured foot led to gangrene later and having her 5 toes amputated. The fuselage of the Howard was their only shelter from the cold, the wind, and the snow. Temperatures averaged minus 40 degrees. Not much shelter, is it? We started looking around the Howard for artifacts. At first we found nothing. Then we started digging around into the peat moss. About 12 inches deep, we began to find sardine cans, oil cans, a toolbox, to name a few. Chris found the fallen SOS sign. My father originally hung this from a tree, which I still don't understand how he was able to climb those tall trees with cracked ribs. Frank found one of the front wheels and the tail wheel as well. After spending 40 days at the crash site, my father decided to move camp to somewhere where they could be seen. Written at the top of the fuselage, you see, went 2 miles downhill, March 16, 1963. Some of the artifacts we gathered were the back of the pilot's seat, the toolbox in the lower part of frame, and Frank holding sardine cans. As much as we had smiles for our accomplishment, we still felt a sense of reverence out of the respect for the two individuals who survived this ordeal. The trail of fallen trees caused by the falling path of the Howard were still obvious 34 years later, which makes one ask the question, how could two people ever survive this plane crash? Our next objective was determining whether the fuselage of the Howard was rebuildable and airworthy. My brother at the time was a captain for American Airlines, and his dream was to build the Howard again and fly it. To determine this, there were two major factors. Was the fuselage straight enough, and how severe was the rust? Considering the impact of the crash, the Howard was straight enough, and since the cold weather causes less moisture, the rust was minimal. Bob, Chris, and Frank all agreed the engine and the fuselage were salvageable. The Howard would be airlifted in 3 different trips. Chris determined that the closest point to the Alaskan Highway was about 35 miles away. He would also need an intermediate stop to re-rig the loads after lifting out of the forest. Chris began to lift out the fuselage. There was no room for error. Our fingers were crossed. Slowly the fuselage was lifted up, and finally the fuselage cleared the trees, and Chris stopped at the closest meadow. Chris dropped the fuselage, his first load, and returned to the crash site to pick up the additional engine and parts. At the meadow, they re-rigged 3 loads into 2 loads. Bob had contacted the Watson Lake office and set up a rendezvous spot on the Alcan Highway. Here you see Frank and Bob guiding the fuselage into the back of the pickup. I still can't believe that Chris could land such a big load with such precision. He was truly a gifted pilot. Here you see Bob securing the Howard to the pickup. At Watson Lake, the Howard was placed on a cart and loaded up into a flatbed. 1 month later, my brother drove from Springfield, Missouri to Watson Lake and returned. It was a 5,500-mile trip. We returned to Whitehorse and gave our final interviews. We discussed our accounts of finding the crash site, retrieving the Howard, and most important, walking the footsteps of our father. For some reason, which I still don't understand, while at the crash site and afterwards, I was on a real high. And after returning home, that high turned to a feeling of loneliness. At the time, I couldn't understand why I had these feelings. In looking back, I can't help but think I felt the presence of my father while at the crash site.